Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
In the intellectual landscape of post-war economics, the edifice of John Maynard Keynes stood as a monumental achievement, a new cathedral of thought for a world grappling with the specters of depression and unemployment. Yet, within its grand arches, certain foundational stones seemed curiously unsettled. For a young, analytically sharp economist named James Tobin, one particular pillar, the theory of liquidity preference, presented an intellectual puzzle of profound importance. The Keynesian framework, while revolutionary, contained an explanation for holding money that appeared elegant in theory yet brittle upon closer inspection. It was a problem whose solution would set the stage for the birth of modern finance. Part of the issue lay in Keynes's own explanation, articulated with characteristic flair in his general theory of employment, interest, and money. He proposed that individuals hold money, a sterile asset yielding no return, for several reasons, but the most volatile and interesting was a speculative motive. According to this view, an investor's decision to hold either cash or interest-bearing bonds was a wager on the future direction of interest rates. If an investor expected rates to rise, which would cause bond prices to fall, they would hold all their speculative balances in cash to avoid a capital loss. Conversely, if they expected rates to fall, causing bond prices to rise, they would plunge entirely into bonds to capture the gain. The model implied a stark, all-or-nothing choice. It was a world of plungers, with everyone betting on one side of the market or the other. This created a significant theoretical inconsistency. The observable reality was that most investors and institutions were diversifiers. They held portfolios containing a mix of both money and bonds, a behavior the pure speculative motive struggled to explain. How could a rational agent, with a single expectation about future interest rates, simultaneously hold a zero-yield asset and a positive yield one? The Keynesian model suggested they would be on one side of the fence or the other, awaiting the moment to leap. This discrepancy left a crucial gap in the microeconomic foundations of a major macroeconomic concept. It was precisely this gap that Tobin sought to fill, armed with a new perspective and a more powerful analytical toolkit. Tobin's landmark 1958 paper, titled Liquidity Preference as Behavior Towards Risk, represented a fundamental reorientation of the entire question. He proposed that the decision to hold money alongside bonds was a problem of risk management. The choice was a trade-off between the safety and liquidity of money and the higher expected return, coupled with capital risk of bonds. Tobin shifted the intellectual focus away from the binary expectations of a speculator and toward the nuanced preferences of a risk-averse investor. In doing so, he imported the rigorous logic of macroeconomic utility theory, particularly the framework for choice under uncertainty developed by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern, into a domain previously dominated by broad macroeconomic assertions. The mechanics of his argument were as elegant as they were powerful. Tobin modeled an investor's portfolio as a combination of two assets: cash, with zero expected return and zero risk, and a consolidated asset representing all risky bonds, which offered a positive expected return, but also a variance, or risk capital gain or loss. The investor's task was to choose the optimal proportion of each. He visualized this choice on a two-dimensional graph. The vertical axis represented expected return, while the horizontal axis represented risk, which he quantified using the standard deviation of the portfolio's return. An investor's personal tolerance for risk could be represented by a series of indifference curves. Each curve connected all the combinations of risk and return that provided the investor with the same level of satisfaction or utility. An investor who was highly averse to risk would have steeply sloped indifference curves, demanding a large increase in expected return for even a small increase in risk. A more risk-tolerant investor would have flatter curves. The available investment possibilities formed what Tobin called the opportunity locus, a straight line starting from the origin, representing a portfolio of 100% cash, and extending upwards and to the right as the proportion of bonds increased. The optimal portfolio for any given individual was found at the point of tangency, where the opportunity locus touched the highest possible indifference curve. The single point represented the ideal balance of risk and return that maximized the investor's utility. For the first time, there was a clear, logical reason for diversification. A risk-averse investor would almost always choose an interior solution, a portfolio containing some cash for safety and some bonds for return. The all-or-nothing outcome of the Keynesian model became a special case, applicable only to the most extreme, risk-loving or risk-averse individuals. Tobin had provided a robust macroeconomic foundation for portfolio diversification, demonstrating how the smooth, aggregate demand for money in the macroeconomy could emerge from the rational risk-managing behavior of individuals. This contribution, while seminal, was built upon the intellectual bedrock laid by his predecessors. The problem itself was a direct inheritance from Keynes. The conceptual approach of treating assets as bundles of characteristics, in this case risk and return, owed a debt to the earlier portfolio analysis of John Hicks. The mathematical language of utility functions and choice under uncertainty was a direct application of the axiomatic framework established by von Neumann and Morgenstern. Tobin's genius was the synthesis of these elements, applying a powerful microeconomic lens to solve a macroeconomic puzzle that had perplexed the discipline. The immediate impact of the 1958 paper was to place the theory of money demand on a much firmer analytical footing. It provided a compelling explanation for the observable world of mixed portfolios and gave macroeconomists a more realistic model of financial behavior. His work demonstrated how individual preferences toward risk could aggregate into a stable, predictable demand for liquid assets, a critical component for monetary policy analysis. Yet, in solving one problem, Tobin's work illuminated the contours of a much larger one. His model elegantly handled the choice between a single risk-free asset, money, and a single consolidated risky asset, bonds. But the real world presents investors with a vast universe of many different risky assets, each with its own unique profile of expected return and risk. His analysis begged a new, more complex question: how should an investor construct the optimal portfolio from this entire universe of possibilities? Answering this would require another conceptual leap, one that would move from the simple trade-off between two assets to the complex optimization across many. It is a challenge that would lead directly to his most enduring contribution to finance, the separation theorem, and place him at the very center of the modern portfolio theory revolution. His analysis of liquidity preference demonstrated how individual attitudes toward risk could aggregate into a stable, predictable demand for liquid assets, a critical component for monetary policy analysis. Yet, in solving one problem, Tobin's work illuminated the contours of a much larger one. His model elegantly handled the choice between a single risk-free asset, money, and a single consolidated risky asset, bonds. But the real world presents investors with a vast universe of many different risky assets, each with its own unique profile of expected return and risk. His analysis begged a new, more complex question: how should an investor construct the optimal portfolio from this entire universe of possibilities? Answering this would require another conceptual leap, one that would move from a simple trade-off between two assets to the complex optimization across many. It is a challenge that would lead directly to his most enduring contribution to finance, the separation theorem, and place him at the very center of the modern portfolio theory revolution. The intellectual landscape for this challenge was already partially mapped. In 1952, a young graduate student named Harry Markowitz had published a seminal paper, Portfolio Selection, that laid the mathematical groundwork. Markowitz showed how to construct what he termed an efficient frontier. This was a set of portfolios offering the highest possible expected return for any given level of risk, which he quantified using variance. His work was a brilliant formalization of the age-old wisdom of diversification. It demonstrated mathematically that combining assets with imperfectly correlated returns could reduce overall portfolio risk without sacrificing expected return. The result was a curved line on a graph of risk versus return, a menu of optimal portfolios for any rational, risk-averse investor. Markowitz's framework, however, left a crucial question unanswered. He provided the menu of best choices, but offered little guidance on which specific portfolio an investor should select from that efficient frontier. The choice seemed to depend entirely on an individual's subjective, unobservable tolerance for risk. A more aggressive investor would pick a point higher up the curve with more risk and return, while a more conservative one would choose a point lower down. The process remained bespoke, a custom tailoring of a portfolio for each individual. The theory lacked a universal principle. It was into the setting that James Tobin introduced a deceptively simple, yet profoundly powerful, element: the ability to borrow or lend at a risk-free rate. This was a rate offered by an asset with zero variance in its return, such as a short-term government treasury bill. Tobin's 1958 paper, Liquidity Preference as Behavior Towards Risk, the very same paper that refined Keynesian monetary theory, contained the solution. He demonstrated that the introduction of this single risk-free asset fundamentally transforms the investor's decision-making process. The result was his celebrated separation theorem, sometimes called the mutual fund theorem. Tobin proved that the complex task of portfolio construction could be cleanly divided into two independent steps. The first step is purely mechanical, a mathematical optimization problem that is identical for every single investor in the market. This step involves identifying one single portfolio of risky assets that is superior to all others. This unique portfolio is found at the point where a straight line drawn from the risk-free rate on the vertical axis is tangent to Markowitz's curved efficient frontier. This tangency portfolio is the one that maximizes the reward-to-risk ratio, providing the greatest amount of return above the risk-free rate for each unit of risk undertaken. The slope of this line represents this very ratio, later formalized by William Sharpe as the Sharpe ratio. The second step is where individual preference enters the picture. Having identified this universal optimal risky portfolio, the investor then decides on the allocation of their capital between two assets, only the risk-free asset and this single optimal risky fund. An extremely cautious investor might put 90% of their wealth into treasury bills and 10% into the optimal risky portfolio. A more daring investor might put 100% into the risky portfolio. An exceptionally bold investor could even borrow money at the risk-free rate to leverage their position, investing more than 100% of their own capital into the same fund. The crucial insight is that everyone, regardless of their appetite for risk, is aiming for a different point on the same straight line. This new line of investment opportunities, connecting the risk-free rate to the tangency portfolio, is known as the capital market line. It represents a set of risk-return combinations superior to those on Markowitz's original frontier. For any level of risk greater than zero, an investor can achieve a higher return by combining the risk-free asset with a tangency portfolio than by holding any other portfolio on the old efficient frontier. The only portfolio shared by both is the tangency portfolio itself. Tobin had effectively replaced Markowitz's entire curve of choices with a single straight line, offering a better deal to all. The implication was revolutionary. It suggested that all rational investors should hold their risky assets in the exact same proportions, namely the proportions of the assets within the single tangency portfolio. This concept became known as the one mutual fund theorem. The world of complex, individualized portfolio construction collapsed into a simple mandate: buy this one perfect fund, and then use risk-free borrowing or lending to calibrate the overall risk exposure to your desired level. The professional task of a portfolio manager was redefined. Their primary job was to identify the composition of this optimal tangency portfolio and make it available to all. Tobin's separation theorem became the indispensable intellectual bridge connecting the work of Markowitz to the next great leap in financial economics. A young scholar named William F. Sharpe, along with John Lintner and Jan Mawson, took Tobin's logic to its ultimate conclusion. They asked a powerful question: if every investor in the market follows Tobin's two-step procedure, what does this imply about market equilibrium? If everyone is trying to buy the same single mutual fund of risky assets, then for the market to clear, that fund must, by definition, be the market portfolio itself, a portfolio containing all risky assets in existence, weighted by their total market value. This realization led directly to the capital asset pricing model, or CAPM, a cornerstone of modern finance. CAPM describes the relationship between systematic risk and expected return for all assets in a market at equilibrium. This entire theoretical edifice rests squarely on the foundation of Tobin's separation theorem. Without his insight that a risk-free asset makes one risky portfolio optimal for all, the logic of CAPM could proceed. Tobin provided the critical link between the microeconomic behavior of an individual investor and the macroeconomic pricing of risk across the entire financial system. He had taken a problem of infinite complexity and, through rigorous logic and one key insight, rendered it elegantly simple, paving the way for a generation of financial theory. This success in linking financial markets to economic decisions would foreshadow his next major intellectual project to building a richer, more realistic model of the entire macroeconomy. His triumph in rationalizing portfolio choice for individual investors emboldened Tobin to pursue an even more ambitious objective: to reintegrate the sophisticated world of finance back into the heart of macroeconomic theory. The dominant intellectual tool of the era, the ESLM model developed by John Hicks and Alvin Hansen to formalize Keynesian ideas, offered a powerful yet starkly simplified view of the economy. It operated within a world of two fundamental assets: money, which yielded convenience but zero interest, and a single homogeneous category called bonds, which served as a catch-all for every other interest-bearing financial instrument. This simplification, while useful for pedagogical clarity, created a critical analytical void. It obscured the intricate channels through which monetary policy had actually influenced the real economy. How, precisely, did the central bank's actions ripple through the complex financial ecosystem to affect a firm's decision to build a new factory or purchase new equipment? The ESLM framework provided a blunt answer, suggesting a simple transmission through interest rates, but it lacked the granular detail to be fully convincing. The stock market, corporate equities, and the valuation of physical capital were largely absent from the formal model, existing as factors outside the primary equations. Tobin perceived this as a profound weakness. He sought to build a richer, more realistic macroeconomic framework that explicitly acknowledged the diverse ways people hold their wealth. His approach was to construct a general equilibrium model where households and firms made continuous choices about their asset portfolios. This was a world with a spectrum of assets, each with its own characteristics of risk, return, and liquidity. The portfolio could include currency, government and corporate bonds of varying maturities. Most crucially, equities, which represent ownership claims on the economy's stock of productive physical capital. In this model, economic agents were constantly rebalancing their holdings in response to changing yields and perceived risks. A change in monetary policy would alter the attractiveness of holding money, causing a cascade of substitutions throughout the entire portfolio of assets, ultimately changing the valuation the market placed on real, physical capital. This intricate model of portfolio balance provided the theoretical engine for his most celebrated and enduring conceptual tool. From this complex machinery, Tobin distilled an idea of extraordinary elegance and practical power, a heuristic that would forever bear his name, Tobin's Q. The Q ratio is a deceptively simple concept. It is defined as the market value of a company's or an entire economy's installed capital assets divided by the replacement cost of those same assets. In essence, it compares what the financial market says a company's physical assets are worth as reflected in its total stock and debt valuation with what it would actually cost to go out and buy or build those same assets from scratch at current prices. This single number created a powerful and intuitive bridge between Wall Street's financial valuations and Main Street's real investment decisions. The logic of Q provided a clear guide for corporate behavior. Imagine a situation where a company's Q is greater than 1. This means the stock market values its existing factories, machines, and infrastructure more than their replacement cost. For managers, this presents a clear profit opportunity. They can issue new stock, which the market is eager to buy at a high price, and use the proceeds to build new capital that costs less than the value the market assigns to it. Every dollar spent on new investment creates more than a dollar of market value for shareholders. Consequently, a high Q serves as a powerful incentive for new capital investment, driving economic expansion. Conversely, consider a Q value below 1. In this scenario, the market values the company's assets at less than their replacement cost. It would be an efficient use of shareholder funds to build a new factory for $10 million when the market values that same factory at only $8 million. The rational course of action for a firm wishing to expand is to acquire existing capacity by buying another company on the cheap, or to return cash to shareholders through dividends or stock buybacks. A low Q therefore discourages new physical investment and can characterize periods of economic stagnation. With this framework, Tobin offered a more concrete and measurable explanation for investment fluctuations than the prevailing Keynesian notion of animal spirits. While Keynes attributed investment booms and busts to waves of inexplicable optimism and pessimism among business leaders, Tobin's Q grounded these psychological tides in observable financial data. A surge of optimism would manifest as rising stock prices, which would elevate Q and thereby provide a tangible, quantifiable incentive for firms to invest. A wave of pessimism would depress stock prices, lower Q, and choke off investment. The Q theory gave economists a variable they could actually track and incorporate into empirical models, translating the ephemeral spirit of the market into a hard number. It became an indispensable tool for econometric studies of corporate investment, allowing researchers to test the strength of the link between financial markets and real economic activity with new rigor. The enduring analytical power of Tobin's Q was perhaps most brilliantly demonstrated decades later in the work of a future chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. In his influential academic research on the causes of the Great Depression, Bernanke drew heavily on Tobin's framework to explain the depth and persistence of the economic collapse. He argued that the debt deflation spiral of the early 1930s, where falling prices increased the real burden of existing debts, had a catastrophic effect on corporate balance sheets and asset values. As firms and banks went under and as the price level collapsed, the market capitalization of surviving firms plummeted. This collapse in financial values, set against the relatively sticky costs of building new factories, sent Tobin's Q for the American economy into a freefall, driving it far below 1. This provided a compelling, mechanical explanation for why investment completely dried up. Firms had absolutely no incentive to build anything new when they could acquire the assets of bankrupt competitors for pennies on the dollar. Bernanke's analysis showed how a financial crisis, through the channel of Tobin's Q, could inflict devastating and lasting damage on the real productive capacity of the economy. It was a masterful application of Tobin's theoretical insight, demonstrating its profound utility in explaining one of the most critical events in economic history. Through his work on portfolio balance and the creation of the Q ratio, James Tobin had successfully woven the complex tapestry of the financial system into the core fabric of macroeconomic thought, building a durable intellectual structure that continues to inform economic analysis and policymaking to this day. His focus now began to shift from modeling the efficiency of these markets to considering their potential for instability. The early 1970s witnessed a seismic event in global finance, the final collapse of the Bretton Woods system, with the United States severing the dollar's last link to gold in 1971 The era of fixed exchange rates gave way to a new, uncharted world of floating currencies. For Tobin, this was a moment of immense consequence. He observed with growing apprehension the explosive growth of international capital flows, particularly in the foreign exchange markets. The volume of currency trading began to dwarf the financial flows associated with the actual trade of goods and services, a decoupling that he believed introduced a dangerous new vector of volatility into the global economic system. Tobin perceived a fundamental problem. The very efficiency of these new electronic markets, which allowed for instantaneous, low-cost transactions, was a double-edged sword. It facilitated legitimate international trade and investment, yet it also empowered a new and powerful class of short-term speculators. These traders could move colossal sums of money across borders in seconds, chasing fleeting arbitrage opportunities and minute fluctuations in currency values. Such activity, in Tobin's view, served little social purpose and could trigger or amplify currency crises, forcing national governments into painful policy adjustments to defend their currencies against speculative attacks. He saw economies becoming beholden to the whims of what John Maynard Keynes had once called a global casino. It was in his 1972 Janeway lectures at Princeton University that Tobin unveiled his audacious and enduringly controversial solution. He proposed a simple, elegant mechanism designed to reassert the primacy of the real economy over purely financial speculation. The idea was to introduce a small, uniform tax on all spot transactions that converted one currency into another. The specific rate he suggested was modest, perhaps 0.5%, a figure small enough to be an insignificant rounding error for a firm importing machinery or a long-term investor building a factory overseas. For these actors, the tax would be a trivial cost of doing business. The true genius of the proposal, however, lay in its impact on high-frequency speculation. For a speculator executing thousands of trades a day, profiting from price changes measured in fractions of a cent, a tax of 0.5% of the principal of every transaction would be prohibitive. It would effectively wipe out the profitability of the shortest term, most volatile forms of currency trading. Tobin famously described his goal with a powerful mechanical metaphor. He wished to throw some sand in the wheels of our excessively efficient international money markets. The tax was a piece of deliberate, carefully calibrated friction. It was economic engineering designed to slow down speculative capital, giving policymakers more autonomy and insulating real economic activity from the froth of financial markets. The initial reception within mainstream policy circles was cool. The proposal arrived during a period of rising faith in market deregulation, making any suggestion of new taxes or financial controls seem anachronistic. Critics raised formidable practical objections. For the tax to function as intended, it would require near universal international agreement. Any major financial center that opted out would become a tax haven, attracting all the speculative activity the tax sought to discourage. This coordination problem was, and remains, the single greatest hurdle to its implementation. Furthermore, opponents argue that any such friction, however small, would impair market liquidity and lead to less efficient price discovery, ultimately harming everyone. The idea was largely relegated to the archives of economic thought for the better part of 2 decades. Yet, the intellectual seed Tobin planted proved remarkably resilient. The concept of the Tobin tax experienced a dramatic revival in the wake of subsequent financial crises. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, which saw speculative attacks devastate the currencies of Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, brought his proposal back into the spotlight. Economists and policymakers, searching for tools to manage volatile capital flows, rediscovered the logic of throwing sand in the wheels. The idea's influence grew even more potent following the global financial crisis of 2008. The near collapse of the world financial system created a profound public and political appetite for reining in financial excess. In this new environment, Tobin's original concept evolved. It became the intellectual progenitor for a broader family of proposals known as financial transaction taxes, or FTT. While Tobin's focus was exclusively on currency markets, his intellectual descendants adapted the core idea to target other areas, such as the high-frequency trading of stocks and derivatives. The purpose of the tax also broadened in these modern discussions. Alongside the original goal of financial stabilization, advocates began to emphasize its potential as a significant source of public revenue, with funds potentially earmarked for global public goods like climate change mitigation or development aid. Tobin's thinking directly shaped the work of a subsequent generation of influential economists. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, for example, became a prominent champion of the tax, arguing for its utility in curbing speculation and providing governments with much-needed fiscal space. The proposal also animated grassroots movements, most notably the international attack organization, which formed in France with the primary goal of advocating for the implementation of a currency transaction tax. The Tobin tax stands as a testament to its creator's unique intellectual character. It embodies his deep Keynesian conviction that financial markets, while essential, require pragmatic oversight to ensure they serve the broader interests of society. It showcases his skill as an economic theorist, crafting a solution of remarkable elegance to a complex, real-world problem. The proposal remains his most famous public contribution, a powerful and persistent idea that continues to fuel debate and inspire policy innovation decades after its conception. This foray into the world of global financial regulation was a natural extension of his lifelong work, which consistently sought to place the technical tools of economics in the service of creating a more stable and prosperous world. His attention would increasingly turn toward the domestic application of these principles, engaging directly with the levers of national economic policy. This intellectual journey into global financial architecture brought his focus squarely back to the domestic sphere, where the grand theories of economics met the formidable machinery of government. Tobin's appointment to President John F. Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisers in 1961 represented a pivotal moment, a chance to translate a lifetime of academic inquiry into tangible national policy. He joined a team of brilliant minds, including Chairman Walter Heller and Kermit Gordon, forming an intellectual core that would champion what became known as the New Economics. This was applied Keynesianism on a national scale, an ambitious project to actively manage the American economy toward the goals of full employment and sustained growth. The central challenge confronting the Kennedy administration was an economy operating below its potential, a condition diagnosed by Tobin and his colleagues as a persistent output gap. Their prescription was a bold use of fiscal policy, moving beyond the traditional goal of balancing the budget to actively stimulating aggregate demand. The intellectual genesis for this approach lay in the Keynesian multiplier effect, a concept Tobin had mastered and taught for decades. The theory held that a reduction in taxes or an increase in government spending would ripple through the economy, generating a much larger total increase in national income. The Council's most significant and enduring policy achievement was the conceptual groundwork for the landmark Revenue Act of 1964. Tobin was instrumental in arguing that a substantial, permanent tax cut would unleash consumer spending and business investment, propelling the economy toward its full employment capacity. This was a profound shift in American economic governance, viewing the federal budget as a powerful instrument for macroeconomic stabilization. The policy's subsequent success in fostering a period of robust economic expansion appeared to be a powerful vindication of the Council's analytical framework and Tobin's deeply held convictions. His time in Washington also sharpened the contours of the central macroeconomic debate of the 20th century, a profound intellectual schism that pitted Tobin's vision against that of his most formidable rival, Milton Friedman. This was a contest between two competing schools of thought, later famously characterized as the saltwater and freshwater traditions. Tobin, a pillar of the East Coast saltwater establishment rooted in the Keynesian worldview of Yale and Harvard, saw markets as powerful yet fallible systems, prone to bouts of instability and unemployment that required judicious government intervention. His entire theoretical apparatus, from portfolio choice to investment theory, was built upon an appreciation for uncertainty, risk aversion, and the complex psychology driving economic behavior. From the shores of Lake Michigan, the University of Chicago's Freshwater School, with Friedman as its leading voice, offered a competing philosophy. This perspective emphasized the inherent efficiency and self-correcting nature of markets. Friedman's monetarism posited that the primary driver of economic activity and inflation was a money supply, and the most effective government policy was a stable, predictable rule for monetary growth. To Friedman and his followers, the activist fine-tuning advocated by Tobin and the new economists was a source of economic instability, a clumsy interference that distorted market signals and ultimately produced inferior outcomes. Their debates, carried out in academic journals, conference halls, and the pages of popular magazines, were a clash of fundamental principles. They explored the very nature of economic freedom, the role of government, and the capacity of economic science to improve human welfare. Tobin argued with a quiet, persistent rigor, his points grounded in meticulous empirical analysis and a pragmatic concern for the human costs of unemployment. Exiting the formal world of Washington policy making, Tobin returned to Yale, yet he remained a towering figure in public discourse. He continued to refine his arguments, engaging with the rising tide of new classical economics that built upon Friedman's foundations. The stagflation of the 1970s provided intellectual ammunition for critics of the Keynesian model, yet Tobin persisted, working to adapt and evolve his framework to explain the new and challenging economic environment. He argued that the shocks of the era, particularly from oil prices, required a more nuanced policy response than simple monetary rules could provide. Reflecting on the full arc of James Tobin's intellectual journey reveals a remarkable and coherent vision. His life's work constitutes a single, powerful argument about the relationship between finance and the real economy. The separation theorem, a seminal contribution to portfolio theory, was an elegant model of how individuals manage financial risk. His Q theory provided the crucial conceptual bridge, explaining how the volatile valuations of financial markets transmit themselves into the real-world decisions of firms to invest in new factories and equipment. His advocacy for the Kennedy tax cut was a direct attempt to steer the real economy using the levers of government, and the Tobin tax itself was a targeted intervention designed to improve the functioning of the global financial system by mitigating destabilizing speculation. Each contribution, from the most abstract theory to the most concrete policy proposal, was animated by a core belief. He saw that financial markets, for all their dynamism, possess an internal logic that can become detached from the fundamental needs of production, employment, and societal prosperity. His genius lay in his ability to master the technical, mathematical language of economics and deploy it in the service of a deeply humanistic goal, a more stable and equitable world. He was a quintessential policy-relevant theorist, a scholar whose intellectual rigor was always guided by a powerful sense of public purpose. The relevance of his ideas has proven to be cyclical, their wisdom often rediscovered in the aftermath of financial crises, when the fragility he so clearly understood becomes starkly apparent. James Tobin's legacy is that of a Keynesian conscience for capitalism, a brilliant economist who provided the tools to analyze our complex world and the moral compass to help us navigate it.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.